Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back. This is our 27th episode. Can you believe it, Michelle?
It's the wrong answer if I say no, right?
We're going to talk more about that later. We've done 6 months, and we have something to say. We want to thank you for listening for these 6 months and what we've learned from the comments you've given us. But both Michelle and I have been on the road for the last 2 weeks, so it's nice to be back at this studio again.
It really is. But before I talk about what we're going to be covering in this episode, I do have to give a shout out to Tom Kalina, our colleague who covered Early Warning while I was out. And
he was great.
He was great.
He's got this PBS type voice, very calm.
I better not leave the office again.
Yeah, don't let him do this again.
Yeah, definitely not.
Good.
But today's Early Warning is going to cover we have a lot going on as usual these days. The upcoming Democratic presidential debate that's going to be airing the day this episode is released.
Great.
North Korea, and then the danger that we will lose the Open Skies Treaty, which has been just a key national security tool.
Yes, one more shredding of the nuclear security regime. And then I answer a question from Johnny in Massachusetts about, what's this? How not to survive a nuclear explosion?
Oh, yeah, he hasn't seen this yet.
Oh,
it's going to be good.
I'm looking forward to it. Great. And the interview this week is with Heather Hurlburt.
Yes. So Heather works at New America, where she is just one of the smartest and funniest analysts that I know.
If you don't know who Heather Hurlburt is, you have got to listen to this interview. She's brilliant.
And she will talk about the current state of our national security and foreign policy institutions and what we should shape them into if given the next opportunity.
Yeah. But first, we just want to thank all of you who are listening to this podcast. Michelle and I have been on the road for the last couple of weeks, and we've heard from listeners, students in Iowa, Rotary Club members in Milwaukee, some of our donors in Minneapolis about how much they like this show.
I heard from a photographer in Oregon, a lawyer in Seattle. I mean, I will say I was really blown away.
We're surprised at how many people listen to this and know the details of it, like questions about whether we really popped champagne on our 21st episode when we were celebrating being legal at 21.
And, really over the past 27 episodes, we've really tried to pull together just a variety of perspectives.
So we pulled some stats together for you. We've heard from artists like Smriti Kashari and authors like Eric Schlosser, senators Chris Van Hollen, members of the House, both current and retired, Ro Khanna and Anthony Brown and John Tierney, former administration officials like John Wolfstall, Lynn Rustin, Wendy Sherman, and Ned Price, just to name a few.
Historians like Alex Wallerstein, leaders of mass movements like Leah Greenberg, and your friend.
A former NFL wide receiver, Patriots, Dante Stallworth. That was a great episode.
It really was. It really was. And to all of this, we're really trying to be intentional about the guests that we bring on. So right now, we've been able to roughly maintain a gender balance. In our long-form interview guests, we brought on 11 women, 15 men. We really hope to maintain a balance going forward. And you can find this episode and all our episodes. If you've missed any, be sure to go back and check them out.
Yeah, plowshares.org/pressthebutton is where you can find us all listed. And we want to thank you for all your comments that you've given us.
And we also want to thank you for all the letters that you've been sending in.
Letters, we get letters.
I
can do the whole song.
I know you can. And we've gotten so many that we decided to create an entire segment dedicated to answering these questions.
Ask Joe.
Ask Joe anything.
So thank you for all the support you've given us and for telling your friends and your families and your colleagues about us and for rating us. These things really matter. It really helps us spread the word. Our listenership has tripled from when we began this show 6 months ago. And thank you. And we're not done yet. We got a long way to go. Stay with us.
And now, the news.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Welcome back to Early Warning. I'm your host, Michelle Dover, returned from my long road trip. And today I am joined by Geoff Wilson, political director at the Council for Livable World and former Plowshares staff.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. Thanks, Michelle.
And we're also joined by John Carl Baker, Senior Program Officer and Nuclear Field Coordinator. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, as you know, we have 7 minutes to discuss the news because that is about how long the U.S. president would have to decide whether to return fire should nuclear weapons be launched at the United States. And with that uplifting way to start, let's go. Geoff, Tuesday is the next Democratic presidential debate. It's taking place in Ohio. So far, we have not heard a lot in these debates about national security, let alone nuclear weapons. Give us a preview. What do you think the candidates will be talking about if they are talking about national security?
So I think it's going to be all about Kurdistan. Turkey just invaded northern Syria, which has been held for a very long time now by U.S. Special Forces and the Kurdish militias, who are other U.S. allies. The abandonment of these allies to the Turks are a complete abrogation of U.S. military values and our values towards our allies. The Pentagon was not briefed on this decision. It just happened. And I feel like the images of U.S. Special Forces fleeing our allies at the approach of an invasion from another ally is going to be something that haunts U.S. policymakers and national security experts. And it should, honestly. I think that this, sort of segues into a larger conversation about nuclear weapons. There are U.S. nuclear weapons about 70 miles north of where this is currently happening in Turkey. And they've been based at Incirlik Air Base for a long time now. And we just had President Erdogan last month say that it's outrageous that nuclear nations have prevented Turkey from acquiring their own nuclear weapons. At the same moment, President Trump, having created this massive problem in Kurdistan now, has said, well, there's a way that we could solve this. We could counter-invade and crush the Turks militarily, who I don't know if you guys realize this, but they're another NATO ally. Or we could crush their economy, which I feel like is a very weird thing for the President of the United States to be saying about a NATO country.
No, and I think your point of how this is really getting at the question of alliances, which is the bedrock of American foreign policy and presence in the international stage, I would also expect to see it. I think you're right on this debate stage. What do you think, though, while there is that nuclear connection, what else do you hope the candidates are going to be talking about? Maybe not at this debate, but at least over the course of the election?
Sure. This country needs to start having a conversation about this new trend of building and deploying low-yield nuclear weapons in our armed services. Right now, there is a conference committee going on with the National Defense Authorization Act on the Hill, and part of it is whether or not we should be deploying new low-yield, finger quotes here, easier to use nuclear weapons into U.S. forces. These are nukes that are not designed to help deter other nuclear powers. They're weapons that are meant to be used alongside conventional U.S. forces on the battlefield. They have a battlefield role. And that is just the sort of nuclear nightmare thinking that I thought that we got rid of just, 20, 30 years ago. Like, why is this all of a sudden a good idea now? And we need to have that conversation. And people that are running for president of the United States need to tell us where they are on this thing that's coming through our budget process right now.
So switching gears, John Carl, North Korea. A couple weekends ago, we saw the first working level talks between North Korea and the United States in Sweden. First time in 7 months since the failure at Hanoi. And each delegation had very different stories about how that went. North Koreans said that the U.S. negotiators didn't come prepared to make a deal. The U.S. said that it came with very creative ideas, thank you, and that it had very good discussions and would see its North Korean counterparts in 2 weeks, to which the North Korean said, absolutely not. It really reminds me of like a social media spat in some ways. Do you think we can make meaningful progress on this?
I do think we can make meaningful progress, but the important thing to bear in mind is that there's a deadline for this progress. Kim Jong-un has said, and the North Korean government has reiterated, that they see the end of the year as the deadline for talks with the United States. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen if there isn't any progress. But it's fair to say it's not going to be good. So if we want to have meaningful progress before that deadline, both sides need to get serious. They need to be flexible. They need to be willing to step back from maximalist positions. And they need to talk regularly. An 8.5 hour discussion in Stockholm is nice, but it's not enough to actually hammer out an agreement. So this is going to have to be a sustained process if we want to actually make progress by the end of the year.
And every time this happens, especially in the U.S., you hear comments of, well, the North Koreans are not really ready to actually make concessions. Do you think that's the case? I mean, you heard the frustration that's come out of these talks and come out of the process.
There's no denying that the North Koreans are tough negotiators and they have their own interests at stake. But I do think that they are willing to make a deal if the United States is also willing to make that deal. And that involves making concessions that may make the United States a little bit uncomfortable. We have to put those things on the table. You can't get something for nothing. And if we're willing to do that, I hope and I think that the North Koreans will be a little more receptive to our overtures. And then there really will be a possibility of a deal between the two countries.
Okay, with just over a minute left, we have our final story related to the Open Skies Treaty. While you quickly Google what that is, 4 senior Democratic lawmakers said on Tuesday that they believe the Trump administration may withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty and have sent a letter to the Secretaries of State and Defense warning them against it. As you know, the Open Skies Treaty, per its name, is related to allowing the signatories, the 34 countries, to do surveillance flights over each other's territories, get a sense of military buildup, whether or not there might be a surprise attack. It's been really useful in monitoring the Russia-Ukraine situation since hostility started in 2014. Why? We have not heard anything about this treaty until this story appeared out of the blue. Why do you think it's coming up now?
I have no idea. My best guess is that this is something that John Bolton wrote up in a memo form on his way out the door and left on the president's decks. This is something that we hadn't briefed NATO allies on. Last week, the U.S. ambassador and the current chairman of the Open Skies Commission just did a victory tour for the 1500th overflight for Open Skies. It was a big press junket. There were pictures taken with other ambassadors about that. This is something that's keeping the world safe from conventional war in Europe. And it's crazy. I think this is just another example of national security decisions being made without any sort of strategy or policy discussion going into them.
I agree. And I think it's further evidence that this administration remains completely opposed to international agreements. Just look at the list of them that they violated, pulled out of, and are helping to destroy. Also, New START, a giant question mark right here. We don't know whether they will extend it, and it's not looking good. I think some of this you can chalk up to the influence of John Bolton, sure, but not all of it. And we can only expect that this is going to get worse.
And with that, our time is up. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me.
Thank you, Michelle.
Letters, we get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Another week, another question. This is the segment where you send in your questions and Joe answers them.
I love this question. And a couple of weeks ago, I said, while you were asking me the question, say the magic word, win $100. And I realized that you don't even know what that means.
Nope, that went right over my head.
And so for any listener who does know what that phrase is from, it's from the early days of TV when I was watching, and apparently Michelle
was not.
And don't Google it. But if you know what that phrase is from, send it in with your question and we will have you jump the queue and we'll ask your question immediately upon receiving the correct answer. Say the magic word, win $100.
And remember, you got to send that into press the button at plowshares.org in order for us to be able to read it.
Okay, so what's this week's question?
Okay, so this week's question is from Johnny in Massachusetts. In Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I told you were going to like this one. Jones survives.
I saw the movie.
Jones survives a nuclear test in Nevada that completely destroys the model town by jumping into a lead-lined fridge. How convenient. Would that have actually worked?
No way. No way. Now, there's a similar episode, which is a little more realistic in one of the Wolverine movies where he goes back in time and he's in Nagasaki. Oh, no, he's in Nagasaki and he saves a Japanese soldier by being in a foxhole deep down under the ground. And that might be more realistic. But in this one, I mean, he's right in the epicenter of the blast. And somehow everything is destroyed around him except for that refrigerator, and he comes out of it alive. So no, there is no way you could survive any of the three major impacts of nuclear weapons. And that is, one, the blast. Highly unlikely that the refrigerator would survive the blast. Two, the firestorm that would be created. I mean, even if somehow the refrigerator were to not be crushed, it would toast you. You know, you would be melted inside that refrigerator. So from the thermal, the firestorm that happens, and then finally from the radiation. Okay, lead. So maybe some, but lead doesn't completely stop radiation. It diminishes the radiation. If you're that close, I'm sorry, man, you are done. And as soon as you stepped out, you'd be completely contaminated. As we saw, for example, from the people who just recently treated the victims of this very small nuclear reactor that was powering that Russian cruise missile that crashed, the scientists who were affected and died from the radiation of that reactor, the medical people who were treating him suffered ill effects from just touching the people afterwards. So I'm sorry, Indiana Jones, you're dead. Michelle, but this is really your field. What would you add?
So actually, when I was at Department of Energy, somebody sent around a memo who had advised the film and how wrong the producers had been and how they didn't take any of their advice. As you said, definitely about the radiation, about the blast, about the firestorm. But also, if you remember in the movie, he's thrown I don't even know how far. And he, tumbles down this hill in the refrigerator and he pops out, completely unscathed. And so I think, the other piece of this is just the momentum. Yeah. He would have been killed just from being thrown that far alone.
That's right. So this is Hollywood. So it's a comic book movie. But by the way, I have on occasion actually consulted with Hollywood on various plots. And many of the TV shows and movies do make a more serious attempt to be realistic, like Madam Secretary. They've done a number of nuclear-themed shows that I've helped with, and they've been dead on. So some Hollywood people actually get this stuff right.
Yeah, and for some, it's not just a plot device.
Yeah. So. Right, it's a teaching moment. Great. Well, thank you, Johnny from Massachusetts.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Dover. I'm one of the co-hosts of Press the Button, and today I am here with Heather Hurlburt.
Great to be with you, Michelle.
Heather is the director of the New Models of Policy Change project at New America, where she leads research into how policy advocacy can adapt to our current environment. She's a frequent contributor across many types of media, including New York Magazine, and has published articles in Politico, Foreign Affairs, National Interest, Fortune, Vox, the list goes on and on. She co-hosts the Dresbert podcast and frequently appears in other types of media. Previously, she ran the National Security Network and has worked in the White House and State Department under President Clinton, as well as working on Capitol Hill and for the International Crisis Group. She is also, to add to that impressive list, a co-author of the recent report, New America report, The Consensual Straitjacket, which, full disclosure, a report that Plowshares Fund is proud to have supported. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Phew.
So to start, can you talk a little bit about your current work at New America? What does it mean to have new models of policy change?
I was thinking as you were reading that even when we wrote the description for the project, we didn't really imagine the current political environment, including impeachment. So
it's gotten pretty extreme.
Gotta update the website. But no, the point that we made, I mean, after me having spent a fairly orthodox career in foreign policy and noticing that it got harder and harder to conduct a coherent U.S. foreign policy because of our political environment, wanted to understand and think more about how you get anything done in an environment where we're increasingly polarized as citizens, and we increasingly take our cues about what we think about issues from political or, frankly, more often cultural leaders, rather than by assessing how the issues actually influence us or things we care about. So we started out in a somewhat more optimistic time looking at left-right, sort of unusual left-right coalitions that, instead of everybody meeting in the middle and saying, oh, we're going to be less Republican or Democrat by doing X, people saying it actually makes me a better conservative. It makes me a better progressive to say, support criminal justice reform or support Pentagon spending reform. And in some ways, those are still the only kinds of coalitions that are getting anything done in this environment. I think if you point to the efforts to end the Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen as a major example of that kind of left-right work. But, faced with this administration and its willingness to turn the policy process to political ends, even those kinds of partnerships are really breaking down.
So let's dive into the current administration and the extreme environment. What are you learning? What are we learning about how not to do foreign policy, and how do these institutions look that you've been working around and in for so long?
So a point that I've been making a lot lately is that you really do need institutions, and you don't know what you've got until they're gone. And it's very popular among some critics of not just this administration's foreign policy, but the foreign policy establishment going back a couple decades now, to say, oh, the National Security Council, it didn't keep us out of Iraq. It didn't prevent Libya from going bad. It didn't do anything constructive in Syria. So, who cares if it doesn't work anymore? Who cares if there's no policy process because the policy process hasn't been turning out good outcomes? But that is, I think, short-sighted is maybe a polite way to say that, because when you are fielding the world's biggest armed forces, when you are spending as much money as the U.S. is spending, and above all, I mean, as is of particular interest to your listeners, when you're deploying the world's largest nuclear arsenal, you really need a very well understood and very well ingrained set of norms and processes about who is allowed to do what in the name of the U.S. government, who is allowed to move U.S. resources around, who is allowed to make claims about, say, just to pick a random example, who sent projectiles into a Saudi oil field. And when you lose those institutions and norms, you lose the ability to control organizations as vast as the U.S. national security apparatus. And that is just a whole nother plane of problem from even, frankly, the policy disputes that we're used to having.
So we're talking on a particularly turbulent week in Washington, where foreign policy is very much influencing domestic policy. And we're starting to really see the breakdown between the two, which you've extensively written about. But in terms of the current moment, in this question of impeachment, in terms of the role of Ukraine, in terms of what the president may or may not have asked Ukraine to do, how does the structure of our institutions come into play?
Well, the whole idea of American representative democracy, and one of the core concerns of the framers of the Constitution, was that public officials couldn't use our institutions to their own personal or political ends. And the framers were really concerned about that when, frankly, there wasn't much of the machinery of the U.S. government to be concerned about. There wasn't even a standing army, if you think about it. When the Constitution was written, certainly they never imagined anything like the American nuclear arsenal. So the idea that a president can get on the phone, apparently multiple times, which I'm sure we will have all the transcripts of by the time this airs. Sorry, they're not transcripts. They're memoranda of conversation.
I know.
Big difference.
Details.
My bad. And say, we have this set of policies that the State Department, the Defense Department, and by the way, Congress, the people's elected representatives have decided that we want to be providing assistance to Ukraine, that actually there is a bipartisan consensus, a cross-civilian and military consensus that a Ukraine that can defend itself against Russian aggression is in core American interests, is in the interest of you and me and all of our listeners going about our everyday lives, and that a president can say, hey, we're not going to do that unless you do me a favor. That is fundamentally undercutting the idea that ours is a government of laws and institutions and not of men and women. And that's just, you can't do foreign policy, you can't do domestic policy, you can't do anything. And again, I say to you, given that this president has mused repeatedly about how he could, for example, end the war in Afghanistan by using a nuclear weapon, or that he could deter the path of a hurricane that was going to strike a state that he needs to go for him in the 2020 elections by using a nuclear weapon, you really don't want to replace the government of law with the government of humans in that circumstance. And that's why this is just so very, very concerning, and every bit as concerning, maybe even more concerning for national security wonks as for domestic focused
Although,
folks.
if we can just take a historical pause and note that the fact that Ukraine does not have nuclear weapons right now as a result of a concerted effort by the U.S. government with close cooperation with allies and working across the interagency to make sure that those were transferred back to Russia at the end of the Cold War. It's something I'm very thankful for right now.
It's worth remembering that effort was undertaken across party lines, across agency lines, and it was a public-private partnership, thanks to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, before we even called them public-private partnerships. So, and by the way, one that was carried out in another moment of great turmoil, change, and uncertainty about what the U.S. role in the world should be after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the crumbling of the Warsaw Pact. But people did manage to come together and make that agreement. And this is in a lot of, although it's a better world in a lot of respects because that happened. And it's also, frankly, a reminder of just how good the American policy process can be.
I like that we have now turned towards hope. And so we are going to leave the current moment behind, or use the current moment to think more about the future. You have written quite a bit on both what you think should be the basis for a new U.S. foreign policy, as well as what you think is missing from the current debate. Tell me more.
So, one of the big challenges we have right at the moment, because we're constantly being bombarded with so many pieces of shocking news, and so many mornings we wake up and the thing that was unimaginable yesterday is now, sort of spread out before us. So it's really a challenge for us, I think, both to say, no, as much as we would sort of all like to go back to 2015, and just say, none of this ever happened and everything, and go back to feeling normal, that it's very hard just to admit, on a human level, it's hard to admit that that's gone. And I think for those of us who built decades of our careers on creating and shoring up the institutions and structures as we knew them in 2015. It's even harder to say, just because I poured 20 years of my life into that doesn't mean that it's going to look like that in 2021. So the first thing that I think is missing from an awful lot of the American foreign policy conversation is a really honest, hard look. And if you take, this most recent UN General Assembly as an example, that you have the U.S. pulling back from leadership in UN agencies. You have China taking over, putting its people into places because the U.S. either can't be bothered or isn't paying its dues. Now, that's not something you can roll back. President Buttigieg doesn't get to go to New York and say, hey, hi, we're here now, so you can all go home. That's not how that works. And at the same time, you have a new coalition assembling itself to defend multilateralism in which the U.S. isn't participating. So what does that mean if, we get to 2021, the U.S. is $1 billion in arrears to the UN. There's a group of countries that have put themselves together as friends of the UN that doesn't include the U.S. And by the way, all of that happening against the backdrop of the U.S. barely showing up at a senior level at the CTBT. Review conversations, who knows what happens at the NPT review conference next year. But I think, again, the courage to look squarely at a world in which these institutions in which we were so invested, some of them can be shored up and saved and need to be. Others of them may have been superseded. So in some ways, there's lots of other good forward-looking ideas that we can have, but I think the first thing is really an honest assessment that we're not going back.
I think the other thing I've really appreciated that you've written is this element that the challenges we're seeing abroad are also mirrored here at home. And this frame of us versus them and the way Trump has actually used that in the foreign policy and to make the foreign policy domestic is a challenge we are still going to have no matter who is in office.
Thanks for bringing that up. And I think much of the excitement around the launch of impeachment this week has maybe led people to pay a little less attention to the president's speech at the UN than they otherwise might have. But in it, the president was very clear, and I cannot think of another occasion in which a U.S. president went to the UN and criticized other Americans from the podium. That's a thing that dictators frequently do. They go and say, oh, it's just my fellow citizens telling you lies. But to have an American president go and lump everyone doing humanitarian work with refugees and displaced persons anywhere in the world under the label of open borders advocates, to then call those people evil. That is number one. It's really worrying because it's very near incitement to violence in the American context. And number two, as you said, it's a signal to people in India and people in Italy and people in Burma and a number of other countries who are trying to enforce their own versions of a unitary ethnicity state, sort of states are states of ethnicities, and that not all rights are equally available to all people, and to really pull back from broader notions of citizenship that had made really changed the definition of democracy and broadened our understanding of democracy in the last 20 years. And as you say, that is a problem that's not going to go away with the presidential election in the U.S. Those, somewhat ironically, for being a movement that very emphatically doesn't believe in global norms and global treaties, it's a transnational movement. And so we're going to have to think about how to deal with it in a transnational way.
So let's pretend the election has happened and that there is a transition team in place into a new administration. They're grappling with these
Your tech person told me I can't knock on the table, but I'm knocking on the table in spirit.
Aren't we all? And let's say, you are tasked with not only grappling with these big picture questions, but the block and tackle of the priorities you would put in front of a new president and the people who would staff that new administration? What are the things that you hope are prioritized or you think are important if we have this chance in the near term to reshape these institutions?
Well, first thing, I'm delighted to say that all of the Democratic challengers have signed on to a pledge launched by the Leadership Council for Women in National Security to make their staffs and transition teams and appointees parity. Have gender parity. So we've asked the various Republican candidates to sign on to that as well. So first, that's something that I very much expect to see. Second point, and this is going to be unpopular with the national security audience, but the next president is going to face also the challenge of what to do about our healthcare system. How to repair the damage to our tax base that was done by the last year's tax bill, and how to put the U.S. back in the forefront of dealing with climate change in a way that is both good for Americans and American workers and galvanizes the kind of global response that we need and that we disappointingly didn't see this week in New York. So the terrible thing, Michelle, about this is I'm not, as much as I want a next president to reconfigure the way we do international economic relations, and I want the next president to rethink and re-strengthen how we relate to Europe in some completely new ways. But I'm not even sure I would put either of those as a higher priority than climate change and reconfiguring our tax base to actually support the kind of government that I want to have. And then I guess the other point, back to your previous question, is just making sure that our institutions function on behalf of everyone who's here and everyone who has rights here is going to be an enormous challenge that's going to require fortitude and patience. My first job at the State Department, I was writing speeches for Warren Christopher, who came in after the debacle of the Iraq War and the false intelligence and so on. And I think often Secretary Christopher used to say, there's an ethical line, and not only do I not want you to walk up to the line, over the line, I don't even want to see the line. And so the challenge of pulling American institutions and norms back to the ethical lines, or creating where necessary new ethical lines, is just an enormous one all by itself.
Final question in terms of priorities. I think you're absolutely spot on. Healthcare, climate, the economy, those are all going to be top priorities. What about the questions of war? And in terms of national security, where do you think that will factor?
Well, a president doesn't get to decide all of that by herself. So there is the very interesting question of, so far, this president both does personally, for all of his bluster and rhetoric, seem to understand that it's not a good idea to get the U.S. embroiled in yet more wars. We may be fortunate enough to get through the rest of this term without a new war starting somewhere. What I think we have to be prepared for is that there'll be a lot of unfinished security business and a lot of actors really eager to test the next new president. So I think whoever that is, and almost doesn't matter who it is, they could be Democrat, Republican, left, right, they will face a lot of security pressure. And I don't know that we will have solved the underlying problem that we have in our politics of confusing using the defense establishment with security. And because that's not a problem that a presidential campaign is the ideal vehicle to fix.
It sounds like whoever it is, they're going to have a lot on their plate. Heather, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.